Thank you for joining us this afternoon for Rhode Island Scaling Success, Key Takeaways from 4 years of intensive intervention work in Rhode Island schools. So a little housekeeping to get started. All participants, please remain on mute. If it goes off mute, we will turn it back on just to keep the focus so we can get through quickly to the panel. Questions are welcome. Please post them in the chat. And at the end, we should have 10 to 15 minutes, if not more, to let the panelists who are implementers speak. Closed captioning is available, and this webinar is being recorded. So introductions. Hi, I'm Nicole Bucca. I'm a senior MTSS implementation specialist, and half of my role for the last 5 years has been intensive intervention. In a previous chapter of my life, I was a special education teacher, an English teacher, an English language development teacher. I had triple certification. And parallel to that, I had 2 children with special needs. So, we are here. I know all of us here today want to see every student be successful. Particularly those that are the most vulnerable and the most complex. And I just want you to know that today our focus is entirely on intensive needs students. And I want you to know that it's more than a job to me. It's really something that's important to me at a personal level. I'm joined by my amazing colleagues. Michelle Bartholomew is here. She is doing all things technology. She is our LMS administrator for the wonderful Bridge RI. Thank you, Michelle. Michelle Walden-Dopke is here. She is our project manager, among other things, also an implementation specialist. She'll be taking questions so that at the end we can engage our panel. And our other colleague, Jen Graham, is here, and she's doing all things extra hands on deck. I just want to thank my team. And a reminder to all of you that, we're very proud what we produced at Bridge RI is really the work of 5 people. We're a small but mighty team. So take a moment now to introduce yourself in the chat to those who are here and participating in this webinar. If you could maybe give your name and your role, and if you have a question that you're hoping will be answered, feel free to put that in because Michelle can gather it for the questions at the end. And while you all introduce yourselves and give us a sense of who's here, I would be remiss if I didn't say thank you. There are so many people who contributed to this work. In fact, I see some old faces that were not old, experienced faces that have been a part of this work for decades. So I want to say thank you, of course, to our partnership organizations, the National Center on Intensive Intervention, which you'll see our timeline soon, American Institutes of Research for our now SISIP work, and now that we're moving into the seamless integration of special education, the Progress Center. In addition, we have multiple lab schools. We also had a middle school, but most of today's presentation is about the elementary school. And none of our work shared today would be possible without these schools. And finally, none of this would be possible without the support of Rhode Island Department of Education. So thank you. Our objectives today. So first, we're going to summarize key findings. 4 to 5 years of work with evaluation, we have key findings. We're going to share training and implementation pathways so that if you wanted to duplicate the work, you could do so. And if you want to consider doing the work moving forward, you can get a sense for how we've done it. Finally, we're going to share the challenges to sustainability. And again, everything today is about learning how to make intensive intervention a reality. We're talking about the lowest 12th percentile and below of your kids on reading and math, and that is the group of students we are focused on today. Okay, quick timeline for some context. So Rhode Island has been a National Center on Intensive Intervention state, sort of like a state lab school, since 2012. From 2012 till about 2014 or so, we had NCII came to our state and trained state coaches. I was one of them. We had others at the state level and district levels. And then NCII moved to a state model, working on supporting states trying to align for scale up. Part of that scale up was the next iteration of the work, which began in 2019, which was the statewide scale up, trying to establish common language statewide and trying to create lab schools so that when people would say, hey, I want to embark on this work, but I don't know what it looks like. Can you tell me somewhere where I can go see? We wanted to create lab schools and deeply invest in them so that others could come see them. So in 2020, we had spent a year selecting lab schools, running various focus groups for common language. We created all these great face-to-face trainings and made assessments of implementation. And then, it's 2020, COVID. So running parallel, luckily, we were preparing for a soft launch of BridgeRI, an online blended learning, professional learning platform. So while schools were in lockdown and dealing with all that you were dealing with, I focused on moving our trainings that were face-to-face to building them onto BridgeRI for a blended model. And then we moved into implementing through the blended model with a focus on evaluation for effectiveness and advanced implementation resources. So in the middle of COVID, yes, we had lab schools doing this work and we were building resources. It's amazing when you look back and think about it. And finally, for the last 2 or so years, we've been implementing deeply, doing that evaluation, and seamlessly integrating special education, which has been the latest round of like our deep work. So that's the timeline. The plan for change from the get-go for this last body of work was, if we train to increase the knowledge of MTSS, particularly Tier 2 and Tier 3, using BridgeRI, then, and coach at the systems level to guide application in practice, then there would be an increase in MTSS implementation. We'd start small at a pilot and then grow it. And finally, this would increase our equitable outcomes. And by increasing our equitable, as we evaluate whether we are in fact increasing our equitable outcomes, we would be improving the model throughout. Keep losing my little, move the slides. There we go. Oops, no, that's not right. Here we go. Pardon me. Okay, so I can't share with you the outcomes unless you know the implementation tools, because otherwise I think the context will be a little lost. So just bear with me for a moment. So we have a suite of implementation assessment tools that were based off the National Center on Intensive Interventions tools, slightly adapted for Rhode Island. So the first tool that I'm going to show you is the Tier 2 and 3 implementation assessment. It's meant to evaluate implementation in one specific context, say math, math grade 1, math grade 1 and 2, math grade K to 5 once we scale up. And you can apply it to both reading or math, but it would be hard for you to answer the questions about both at the same time. Let's put it that way. This assessment was completed by the child by child team, whatever you call your child by child team in your building. And it's broken into 3 parts, like all things at MTSS. Data to drive decision making. So you can see here the buckets within data. We have screening tools with entrance decision rules. We have progress monitoring tools and progress monitoring procedures. Practices, evidence-based practices. You can see here the practices that we are looking for. We're not going to get super deep because you have the resources. Actually, that's a good point to mention too. You have these resources that I'm referencing both in the calendar event. It might be shared in the chat by my colleagues, and after the webinar, when we share the recording, we will share the resources again. So please, if you don't want to go look at them because it would distract you, that's a good call, probably. And finally, systems, teaming infrastructure, supporting staff, partnering with families. So let's spotlight in really quickly on one that frequently wasn't happening in schools, just to give you a sense of what we're looking for. Let's spotlight progress monitoring procedures. So within that bucket, on this Tier 2, Tier 3 implementation assessment, we would have the following criteria, 1 through 6 here. So you can see in number 1 that baseline data are used to set goals as either the benchmark performance for most kids, or using the rate of improvement norms for a few. So it was common when I entered schools that they were either not setting goals, or if they were setting goals, they weren't using a systematic way to do so, okay? And especially with the Andrews Supreme Court case saying that we have to have rigorous goals in special education, it's really important that we know how to set goals based on a scientific method. So that's one of the first things we want to teach them. 2, we want to use that progress monitoring data not as raw data points, okay? We want to see a goal line versus a trend line. So if you look here on the left, this is an example. When I came in to work with schools, a lot of times they would say, oh, he's progressing. It was 477 raw score 2 weeks ago, and now it's 479. And, the problem with that is compared to what? Like, what are we trying to accomplish? So here you can see that we have set a goal, that's the green dotted line based on a scientific method, and we can see the student's data. This student, the last 5 data points are below the goal line. This student is not responding adequately enough. He's responding, or she, or they. He's responding, just not enough. So don't change the intervention. We need to do DBI. So we can go, if you scroll down, you can see these are the kinds of procedures we are teaching these schools. The training is all available on BridgeRI. Okay. Now we move on to Spotlight Intensive Intervention because there's another assessment, okay? This is the intensive intervention process. You can see it starts with a standard intervention platform that targets certain skills. We progress monitor with valid and reliable tools. Kids who are responding, we just keep doing that standard protocol. Kids who are not, we dive deeper into what is the need, how we're going to intervene, and then continue to progress monitor to see if it worked. Little side note, Rhode Island has a slight because we in Rhode Island are proud to say that we have had a merged behavioral, social, emotional, and academic model for a long time, but a lot of the country has not. Our diagnostic process is not just, say, reading diagnostic or math diagnostic. It involves behavior and social emotional. So a student could be an isn't doing, which is a performance deficit. What we would do to intensify would be to increase engagement, motivation, and belonging. Could be a trouble doing, which is they're getting it, they're just having trouble like using it in new contexts. They're having trouble applying it quickly and with a lot of accuracy. So basically we'd provide executive functioning supports. And then can't do is when it's actually a skill deficit. And I think one of the things I'm really proud of in Rhode Island's work is if your MAP, which I'll explain in a moment, if your MAP does a good job targeting needs with academic interventions, I have never seen us get to a non-responder, a student who needs more intensification. It's always an isn't doing and a trouble doing. It's not an academic root cause. It's behavior, it's engagement, it's motivation, or it's executive functioning supports. Okay, so when we do DBI, right, I'm trying to explain to you how I assess. We'll be holding a data-based individualization meeting. The team will be doing that. And I will use the tool that's here to the right, which will be in your links, to basically say how much fidelity are we keeping to the process. And I give them feedback like, okay, you had a little trouble with this step, use this tool, try that again. And this is how the coaching goes. Okay. So you saw two assessments, the tier 2 and 3 implementation assessment and the DBI fidelity tool. Those assessments across all the lab schools, which there was a good amount of them across the state, summarize the following key findings. If you are a Rhode Island elementary school, you likely have the following strengths because all of my lab schools did. They all had a child-by-child team. They all had a universal screening tool. And in most situations, the universal screening tool could also be the progress monitoring tool, and it should be. So these are our celebrations. Let's see if I can do my balloons. Yeah. Oh, okay. I guess it doesn't work when you have a background. So these are our successes. Challenges. Not one school, so this is probably a systemic issue, not one school was evaluating the effectiveness of their interventions. And that was in part because they didn't really know often what interventions were taking place. 2, they had a child-by-child team, but their process was not systematic. They were not using a systematic process like data-based individualization. This was something that could move very quickly with training. They had progress monitoring tools, but they often were not setting goals, or they were not setting goals in a scientific manner, and it was often inconsistent at best. Like maybe the specialist was doing it, but anybody else who was providing interventions, they were not doing it. And finally, and unfortunately, I would say this has been my hardest lever to move in this work, which is partnering with families. Schools had minimal engagement with families regarding their screening, intervention, and progress monitoring data. And even with providing tools and resources, I still struggled to get out of pilot mode and into something broader. Some of my more recent schools are really, taking that on with some gusto, but it's a weakness. Okay, so what moves first in implementation? First, we start here on the left. Strengths get stronger. So they already had a child-by-child team. What that team does starts getting a lot more systematic pretty quickly. If they already had screening, their work on entrance decision rules, which you'll see in a moment in the map, gets better. And usually some small tweaks in progress monitoring happen all in year 1. By year 2, we are moving into having an intervention, at least having clear interventions, at least at the pilot grade level, where we can evaluate outcomes and evaluate the effectiveness of the map. And it takes later to get to supporting staff, family engagement, and sometimes DBI. It depends what order people chose. This is why systems change is a 2 to 3 year, a 3 to 5 year commitment. Sorry, can't talk today. You can see that this is year 1, this is year 2, and this is year 3, 4, 5. Okay, so let's talk about training and implementation pathways. We have got this down to a science. Okay, in year 1, the child-by-child team provide, and this is before they've done any work whatsoever, they're just starting to work with me. The year 1 provides baseline business as usual data. What is that data? Whatever the pilot grade level and area they're going to do, we're going to focus on grade 1 reading, grade 2 math. They're going to give me their previous year's screening data and RICAS scores in, well, that grade level doesn't have RICAS, but you understand, business as usual, so that we have something to compare to after we make changes. Then in year 1, this is like the first training year, so maybe that last one was the summertime. We want to establish common language. That's our goal, readiness. And we're going to take the Bridge RI Tier 3 overview course. So it's on a computer and it's a blended model. They do portions of the course and then we come back together. When we come back together, me and the child-by-child team, we debrief if what they learned about definitions of Tier 1, 2, and 3 and more, if they were common. Does the school have this common language? When you say Tier 3, do we all mean the same thing? I have never heard anybody say yes. It's usually, oh no, we got to work on this. The language is not aligned. So then this particular team and the principal will plan activities during faculty meetings, common planning time to work on common language. And sometimes they will use the MTSS overview course as part of their professional development to accomplish that. Okay, still in year 1, usually this is late fall, early winter. We're now going to do the first Tier 2, 3 implementation assessment. The reason we do this after the overview is because if you complete the assessment without common language, you're going to rate yourself either higher or lower because you don't really understand what the assessment is asking you. So we do that, and then we move to step 2. This is where I've seen schools go in 2 different directions. Some schools go this route, focusing on the map. Oh, sorry, I made more balloons. Some schools focus on implementing DBI because they already have a child-by-child team. I recommend the top row because, and I'll explain it in a moment, hang on. If your goal is first to implement the map at 1 grade level in 1 area, 2nd grade math, your child-by-child team is going to take the Tier 3 practices course on Bridge RI on their own with you all as a team, and I'm not there. Then when we get together in our applied model, because this is a blended model, I'm going to help them evaluate the interventions they have in their building and build their map with a plan to implement at 1 grade level. Now, if we want to share with the broader staff, sometimes we only target the pilot grade level, and we might ask them to do the Tier 2 practices course to help them understand what is coming their way and to help them engage in that process. The Tier 2 version is like a little bit more like the 101 version, whereas the Tier 3 is a lot deeper. It's more specialist. Okay, so that's the map. That's what I advise. Some schools, though, would prefer to go right into DBI. And the only reason I say I worry about doing that is because you can run a DBI meeting. You're still going to hit that you don't have interventions. Like it's going to trip up your meeting processes because you don't have the prerequisite skills that you need. So if you choose to implement DBI first, you would take on Bridge RI the Tier 3 systems. The child-by-child team would implement DBI protocols in a team meeting, and we would spend time preparing staff that child-by-child meeting is no longer going to be what often it is, which is admiring the problem, that when they come in, we are going to end that meeting with a clear action plan, clear timelines, and who's doing what. Oops, sorry. Okay, well, let's talk about the map briefly. So across all the schools, so this is a systemic, this is not one school, struggled with this, this was all. Before we built the map, interventions were very person-driven. We might know what one person did for interventions, say the specialist, but we might not know what all the other kids, what about all the kids in the yellow? What about the kids that are left behind in the gen ed classroom because the specialist didn't take them? What intervention were they getting if they were flagged? Interventions were person driven, not system driven. And as a result, they lacked cohesion. We also found that people were not consistently progress monitoring. They often didn't have goals. We always found, almost always, actually, I think it is always, that students with IEPs were not receiving interventions. They were being plucked out of the screening data and popped over in special ed land. And finally, we found that intervention intensity had a mismatch. I'll give you an example. High need students, 12th percentile and lower, were getting intervened with tier 1 resources, which ended up looking like, I kind of call it like limping along in the core curriculum, right? It's like kind of like work completion and, maybe a little bit of support with that core class, but nobody was filling their gaps. So with the map, and this is a complex topic, if I go a little too fast, please know the tier 3 practices course goes a lot deeper. So with the map, we try to move away from just we screen and the kids are either red, yellow, green, and we send them to a person, right? We try to make it a system. And within a lot of tools, there's a lot more information than just the color of the child. So the colors are just the intensity of the student's need, right? So this example we see in front of us is Ames Web. Every kid had a color. It represented the intensity of their need, but the pattern of how they did on the probes on Ames Web tells you what their most foundational skill deficits are. So the probes go from most foundational to most complex skills, right? So like this is going to be basic early numeracy, this is going to be computation, this is going to be application, and you can see by the pattern of how kids did what grouping they need to be in. And so the map systematizes that process. So when I get a student whose first probe they didn't meet benchmark was number comparison fluency pairs. It's a Rhode Island thing, right? I know that they need early numeracy, that we have to work on quantity, smaller and greater. This is where they're at in their learning, but we can't stop there. We need to get into the grade level stuff too. So this intervention is going to put those things together. And again, see where it says insert names? All names. Every student at the grade level, their names go in here in the first column that they did not meet benchmark for that particular probe, even kids with IEPs. So then the next question is, okay, I know my entrance decision point, I know the intervention target, I know the kids. What does the instruction look like? So you can see here that we used to just do like intervention menus, and it would only be intervention. But what we found was, or at least what I found was that tier 1 didn't seem to think they had a role. They do have a role, right? So we put tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 on the same map so people can see how it all fits together. We want to be a pit crew for kids. No more cowboys, pit crews. So you can see here that the students that were the lowest level, the first probes, K level, and this is probably a second grade map or a first grade map, they need scaffolding in their tier 1 instruction, right? So they're in core, but they're not going to be successful without scaffolding. Okay. And everybody's in core, see across the green. Now, the tier 2, remember in the DBI protocol, the first thing is an intervention platform. Okay. So the platform is different for different groups of kids, but it should match the need based on the data. So what you're seeing here in this first column is for the most intensive need kids, it is a multi-component, highly explicit intervention, and the tier 1 teacher has to do scaffolding within core or else more gaps will be produced. And I think, yeah, there were a lot of lessons learned here. Often when I came into schools, there was actually no intervention for this group of kids. Like I said, a lot of limping along the core curriculum. And what we know, I don't want to bore you with like researchy stuff, but what we know from research, I'll just try to say it briefly, is the students for whom an otherwise effective core doesn't work, they share a common neurobiological profile of their thinking, right? So they tend to have memory issues. They tend to have attention issues. They might have language barriers. And I mean like language-based disabilities, not multilingual learners. They tend to have behavioral issues that prevent learning. So the intervention here has to look significantly different because it has to remove all those barriers. Memory issues, how do we solve that? Highly repetitive intervention. Language issues, how do we remove that barrier? The intervention has very controlled language and it only builds very systematically. Attention issues, how do we solve that? The intervention will be very, I say, you say, I say, you say, I say, you say, because that perky pace is what helps kids with attention issues. So, a lesson learned. Tier 3 intervention does not equal more of the core instruction. And what I'm showing you right here is, this is the baseline data of a school that I came into to work with. And see those red, fall, winter, spring, they were doing more of their core high quality curriculum, which is good for everybody to get in tier 1, and it's good for most kids all the time. But for these kids, when they continued to get more of that, they were not progressing. And I'm really lucky that every school, well, most schools that I worked with, once I could show them that baseline data, their higher levels of administration were like, okay, we're piloting, we're keeping it small, we're open to this experiment with data-driven decision making. And why is it that that intervention that I just showed you a moment ago is appropriate for these kids? On the right, it's just a deeper topic than we have time for today, but these are what we call the taxonomy of intervention intensity. These dimensions are the dimensions that make an intervention intensive. And what I found was most schools either had nothing in the most intensive column curricularly, they didn't have an intervention, or they were using an intervention that was not intensive. Like they were using something like, I don't know, UFly or something like that in a very intensive group of kids. And again, those interventions are good. They're just not intensive enough for this group. Okay, so now in the middle here in the yellow, again, a standard protocol intervention. These students have the skill. What they need is students with math difficulty, per the research, need sometimes 35 to 40 more exposures with practice, highly engaged, before they commit things to long-term memory. So that's what makes them fluent. These are fluency interventions. So this school put peer-assisted learning strategies in their tier 2 for these 3 groups. And notice that because it's only 3 days a week, 20 minutes, they could still have time to do more of their core instruction in a more differentiated, targeted manner as well. And then finally, the kids for whom they had all of this proficient and mastered, all of this computation, they were fluent, all good stuff. Now we're doing with them work on word problems, so more advanced application. And if you did all of this, they're going to be, by winter, these kids are going to be moving over here into word problems. Whoops, sorry, I think I skipped a slide. Boom, word problems, application. And what I wanted to also throw in there is almost all of these interventions are trainable for free on BridgeRI, and PALS is a very inexpensive intervention. It's like maybe $30 for the manual. And the word problem one is actually free in the BridgeRI courses. Why? Because the researchers shared them with us. And finally, at the bottom of the map are the progress monitoring expectations. And what I found was every person in a school was kind of coming up with their own progress monitoring expectations. There wasn't really a clear system. Once you put the map together, everybody can see, no matter what adult has these kids, this is what we expect to see you doing for progress monitoring. Okay, so quickly, what changes did the map produce? Sorry, lost my flow. Okay, first, students at risk all received interventions. We kept the kids with IEPs in there. Interventions are general education. Least restrictive environment says they belong in the least restrictive environment with their peers, and so we're going to meet their needs. Finally, over here in the pinky block, intensive intervention is truly intensive. It doesn't look like core because data had demonstrated that these students were not progressing with core, so we don't do more of that. We're going to do something different and keep them in core in tier 1 because now we're going to fill the gap. They're going to do better in tier 1. We're good. It's multi-component. It's 5 days a week. It's tier 3. Next, the interventions are a cohesive system. Each kid is getting what they need to be successful in the tier 1 curriculum. Some kids need a multi-component, highly different way of teaching. Some kids need more practice and fluency building, and some kids need advanced application. It's all cohesively built into this map. Progress monitoring is consistent. No adult doesn't know the expectations, and we're going to look at the data as it's going. So, everybody knows what to do. And if you see at the bottom, it's very clear. It tells you which probe, the number of weeks, how to set the end goal, and when it's time for DBI. Okay, so year 2, back to our training sequence. Year 2, we once again assess the tier 2 and 3 implementation, and that's because it moves quickly. I can give your district look at this change over time. It's beautiful. You'll see some. Usually by year 2, they are implementing the map at a pilot grade level, trying to do so with the best fidelity they can. The child by child team takes the tier 3 data training so that they can look at the progress monitoring data so while they're learning, they apply it. They're going to support all that, and then they're going to update the staff on how things are going because it's going to go well. And that makes the staff really interested in learning more, and it makes them want to get on board. And also year 2, by December, January, we now have enough data points in our progress monitoring. See, if you look right here, here's the DBI process, right? The standard protocol part is what you see here in the map. Implementing PALS, implementing the word problem, implementing connected math. Those are the standard protocol. The progress monitoring is the part at the bottom of the map. We have done this part. Most kids are going to be responsive. Promise you, if your map was made well, that's what's going to happen. A couple of kids are going to come up that they're not, and now we're going to do DBI. So this is when I recommend that the child by child team be trained on the protocols for the DBI process. That's the tier 3 systems course. We implement DBI with the students that were in the map, with families, and we continually share out with staff our successes, which there are a lot of successes. And then year 2, at the very, very end, we once again do the implementation, the tier 2, 3 implementation assessment, so we can see the progress over time in implementing MTSS, and we evaluate the map's effectiveness. Why? Because now we're either going to scale up if it's good, or we're going to revise the map because something didn't work. So what does that look like? I just thought this would be the quickest way for me to kind of show you. I have like a certain spreadsheet where they keep their fall, winter, and spring screening percentiles. And the first thing we do, because I just think it's very intuitive to people, is we look across the fall, winter, spring. Did everybody go green? Right? That's what we need. We need to see how the red went green. The yellow went green. And then we even go down further to see, did our enrichment kids grow further? We keep going. So at the most simplistic level, this is how we evaluate the map. Okay. Outcomes and long-term impact. Few caveats. I'm not a statistician. In fact, I'm busy building courses. I'm training schools. I'm making tools. I am not a mathematician. This is an informal evaluation. We actually have an independent evaluation team that is going to evaluate this data formatively with that level of depth. We just don't have the results yet. It should be in about a month. This is research to practice, so it's messy. I will tell you several iterations of this outcome analysis didn't work. Oh, this kid, his parents opted out of RICAS. Oh, this kid suddenly is homeschooled. Oh, COVID, right? It's messy. So what you're going to see here is messy. And finally, I want you to know that the evaluation did evolve. You're going to see the graphs change in the way they're laid out, which might confuse some people. I apologize, but it's because this is 5 years of evaluative data. So every time we got better at something, the question changed and then the graph changed. Okay. So you're going to see a pattern. First, it's going to be implementation. How is this school site doing implementing the tier 2, 3? Then, did it move screening, your benchmarks? Because if it moved screening in the short term, it should move RICAS in the long term. So this is the pattern you're going to see for each school. Okay, school A. This is the tier 2, 3 buckets. I wouldn't worry so much about reading them, okay? But what I want you to see is that between 2021 and 2024, this is just pre-post because I didn't want to confuse you with all the different bars. This school was still not implementing fully. I want you to see that these bars, they don't go up to 100%, right? We can still move outcomes without getting it fully right. And this school had 3 principals in 3 years. Yay, COVID. So this data is only the screening data, right? This is their math benchmark or math screening data. And you can see that the fall is in blue. So we have 14 kids in urgent, 29 in, percent, 14% in urgent, 29% in intervention, 57 meeting, exceeding, etc. Okay. The red is by spring. By spring, there were no students at risk for poor math outcomes in this kindergarten class. Same school, same year, first grade. Didn't have a lot of risk going into first grade. They had 17% in intervention, but no urgent. But by spring, there were no students at risk for poor math outcomes. And this school did what we usually advise, which is MTSS is a prevention framework, so start it as young as possible. Because they started young and were with us multiple years, their prevention was effective. We were trying to move up to where RICAS data was available, and unfortunately, they had no intensive intervention needs students at 4th grade. Therefore, we could not do that level of analysis at 4th grade. By 5th grade, they only had 1. But we'll show you the one. So please keep in mind when I show you this that it's an N size of 1, which is, borders on, I probably shouldn't even show it, but let's just, for the sake of transparency. Now these graphs are going to look a little different, okay? What I did was had to take the intensive intervention group, which in this case is just 1 kid, and all the other kids. These are non-intensive intervention kids. They're over here. This is the screening assessment growth. So from fall to winter, the 1 child in intensive intervention grew this much. From fall to winter, the non-intensive intervention kids grew this much on the reading screening tool. Oh, this was math, I think. And by the way, math and reading, very similar. Like it's irrelevant which one you want to talk about, same type of outcomes. And by the winter to spring, the intensive intervention group grew like this. The non-group grew like this. So while this is not formal assessment, it's correlation. This may suggest that in foundational skills, the intensive intervention kids benefited more than the students who were not receiving intensive intervention, which is what we want. Now, here was their overall RICAS score. And again, it's by groups. Here is the intensive intervention group. The score in the 2023, 2024, kids that are not intensive intervention, score 2023, score 2024. And what was their RICAS growth? It was even. Now, in some ways, this might suggest that while the intensive intervention moved foundational skills deeply, suggest, I don't know that for a fact, it appears like it didn't really have any meaningful impact on the RICAS growth outcomes. Although, it's hard to say, would that child have not made equal growth to the others if he or she, they did not have the intensive intervention? I cannot speak to that. Okay, let's move to school B. Again, this is look at their implementation, stronger than the last school, but still not perfect. And this school district struggled with district incoherence, which I will explain under barriers. Another graph, I'm sorry, we were working with URI at this point, so this is a different graph too, but it's actually very similar. Instead of being bars, it's a line, but it's a similar concept, okay? The green line are the students who had the core intervention, the core tier 1 only, even during intervention block. This is their screening data, their reading screening data. The tier 2 group, the particular person who was doing tier 2 wanted to use Spire, so it was a Spire group. This is their data across the school year. And then the intensive intervention group, which was reading mastery, they're right here. And intervention was not 5 days a week. So please note that if you look back at their implementation, they were not meeting the dosage requirements for intensive intervention, but they were still implementing. And with reasonable fidelity, it just wasn't enough dosage. So what I want to show you here, and I think you probably can see it already, is the achievement gap was narrowing. Okay, every other group of kids started to dip winter to spring. These kids were continuing. And if we had had the dosage we needed, it's possible, I can't say for sure, that we could have been going even higher. Achievement gap closing. Again, I don't know that for a fact. I know I'm passionate, so it comes off like it's a fact, but you know. And then finally, that same group of kids. So here we're looking at the kids in the red. That same group of kids, this particular school used STAR. So STAR is their screening tool for reading, and it has a tool called SGP, which basically says for kids who started at the same level, so they're also low in their reading skills, what we would expect for growth is between the red lines. This is typical SGP growth. You can see that the kids in the intensive intervention are pretty consistently, with the exception of one who was not receiving DBI but should have been, we were well above what is considered a typical SGP. It was working. And by the way, look at all the kids that had IEPs. And I cannot tell you how many people, and I'm sure myself included when I was in the classroom, don't think kids with IEPs can make progress like this. Let's see. Oh, those went backwards. Sorry. And I did not have RICAS on this school because of COVID. And by the way, because of district incoherence, this is the year this district chose to stop doing this work. We'll talk about that in the barriers. Okay, last school, and I got to move quicker because we got to get to our panel. Again, look at that varying. Nobody's perfect. Implementation is not perfect. Look at all those years. They had coach turnover, team turnover, district lead turnover, everybody turned over. Okay, now, this graph looks a little different again, but it's the groups, right? This is the intensive intervention group, 7 students. This is all the other kids. And this is their screening percentile as a group. So they started below 10th, ended up by winter 17th. You can see what I'm saying, right? By spring, these are the non-intensive intervention kids, their growth fall to winter to spring. So even though obviously we're still needing to do work with these kids, let's talk about the growth. The growth on the benchmark screening tool of their foundational skills. From fall to winter, intensive intervention grew like this. Non-intensive intervention grew like this. From winter to spring, intensive intervention grew this much. Non grew this much. Again, not a formal analysis. It does appear that the students with intensive intervention benefited, particularly in the fall. I couldn't tell you why that is, but that they benefited more than the non-intensive intervention students. So here's their RICAS scores. This group is 5 students, and I think this is not super relevant, so let's move into the RICAS growth. The intensive intervention kids as a group grew by 5. The not intensive intervention kids group went down by 9 as a group. Again, not a formal analysis, but suggesting that the intensive intervention students did benefit, even on RICAS, by having the intensive intervention. Really, the best way to look at data of this nature with kids that are this complex is child by child. So that last group of kids, I pulled their data in more detail so that you could see them. Here's the last 5. What I want to show you is, at the top, you're going to see their screening, fall to winter to spring, see the change over time. Then you're going to see their RICAS score, 2023 to 2024. Then you're going to see the RICAS SGP, so that you can see change over time for all kids. Let's look at the first one. The first one, you can see we went from the 1st percentile in the fall to the winter 6th to the spring 33rd. It went up 33 points. I'm sorry, 33 percentile. Like, see the bell curve here? That's a nice change, and that's intensive intervention. Because of that, their RICAS score went from 449 to 469, 20 points, and their RICAS SGP was high. Now I will give you a moment to just look at the rest of the kids. Takeaways. This student right here who didn't get DBI because it's an advanced level of implementation, so they were not able to implement that yet, needed DBI, okay? When you don't grow on the screener, you don't grow on RICAS. Like, it's a correlation. This student was not progressing, probably attendance or behavior or SEB issues, but the rest of them, I hope you can see, pretty impressive. And let's talk about RICAS proficiency. I find sometimes when people say, is it working? All they care about is RICAS proficiency. That's a shame, because I want you to notice that This one right here, which was our highest, most impressive intensive intervention change, was at a 1 and stayed a 1. But they went up, what was it again? I want to do the math again. 20 points? They went up a lot. They had high SGP, meaning you can't expect too much more than that on RICAS. And 469, 472 was a 2. They were only 3 points away from being a 2. I strongly discourage using nothing but RICAS. And I want you to know, though, for our work, we are definitely committed to moving RICAS as well. When you have deficits, when you have students that have fallen this far behind, it takes some time. Okay. Some people might ask, Nicole, which elements move outcomes the quickest and the most powerfully? It is having an intervention platform. It is having that map that moves the outcomes the quickest and the most pronouncedly. Pronouncedly? I made that word up. And obviously, if you progress monitor, that's important too. So, but it's just a little bit less important. It is important, but like initially, people don't even have interventions. Okay, and then what happens? Oof, right? 2 years in, we got interventions, and there always something goes wrong. What are the challenges to sustainability? Okay, I want you to notice that as I was tracking over the 5 years, challenges to sustainability, all of these, everything but the orange, is turnover. Principal turnover, team member turnover, new coach turnover, everybody turned over post-COVID. The only other element is district incoherence. And what that means is, and everybody means well. Everybody has children's best interests at heart. It's just, there's a lot of competing priorities. There's a lot of competing political aspects. This means that at some point, some staff were not on board. Often it was like a tier 1 leader of reading or math, or maybe an interventionist, and other people wanted to move forward with the map, but these people didn't. And the leader didn't step in or just didn't feel like they should, and that's when the work kind of fell apart. Okay, so we have challenges, but for every challenge, there's also a facilitator. Now I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip these next 5 slides, 6 slides. You have access to the slides. I will, it's in the calendar event. You can look at them. Plus there's a video and a handout. So I feel comfortable saying, if you're a leader, please take a look at that. But generally speaking, in that handout about what works, what's effective leadership, you'll see that it has to do with really making it a prioritized part of your world and making sure that you have a coach. You need a coach. I'm going to train the pilot group, but from then on, somebody else has to continue the scale up. You have all the resources you need on Bridge RI. The next thing we do for leaders is we proactively address any incoherence, which is basically just to give them a heads up, like, let's not let this ruin us. Okay. If you want to learn more, we are now taking registration for people to come see a lab school in action, to see a DBI process, to ask them questions. The link will be in the chat. It's also will be in the email when we send with all the resources. You can schedule to come and see a school. Okay. Phew. I was a little late. Time for Q&A with our panelists. I would like to introduce you to Julie Mayhew, who is the Director of Curriculum Instruction and Assessment at Burrillville School Department. And the principal in her district is Courtney Francis. And I want to say that Burrillville is a relatively newer district. They're only in year 2, but they are high flyers because their district leadership has been deeply involved from day 1, and it really shows. In addition, we have Jill Richard. She is the best coach I have ever seen of this work, and she is from Gloucester School Department. We are looking for questions. I guess I will ask some questions. So, I think that if I start with you, Jill, the Foster Gloucester's experience has been up and down for 5 years. And I think right now you're finally starting to get some traction. Do you care to speak as to what you think is finally the magic that now is making things kind of move and head where we want them to go?
Yeah, I'll do my best. I don't know that there's magic. I think it's, like you said, being part. I came in late also to this. When I became coach, you had already started with Gloucester and things had already started going and there was a map. So I think it's being willing to learn. And then when you're at the meetings, taking what you've learned. And then also with you, what I really appreciated is there was some training that I would get from Nicole. We would meet like once a month or sometimes every 3 weeks, and she would help to continue to train me to take what I was learning. And we started with one school, and take that and then work with those people there. And then it's also building it out from our DBI team, which we've done at PDs and some faculty meetings. But you have to keep reiterating and keep saying the same things over and over again, because it does become ingrained in our brains, but the language for the staff and faculty, it takes some time for them to understand it and to really, the more we use it at we call it data meetings when we're looking at data and our grade level teams are there. They are now using it more coherently and they're understanding it, but we have to live it and breathe it often throughout our data meetings, throughout our PD, and just conversations throughout the year.
Thank you. And I will say that Jill has done an amazing job. She's juggling 2 schools and they're in 2 different places. And you need someone who knows it deeply to kind of be there in those everyday moments where it needs clarification. I'm being told that we now have 3 questions. Michelle, do you want to give us one of them for maybe Julie or Courtney?
Sure. The first one is, you mentioned PALS in the platform as a recommendation for Tier 2. You did not mention Tier 3 interventions.
I can jump in for that one. So we use PAL, we use PALs for Tier 2 math, and then for Tier 3 in 2 districts now, I've used Connecting Math Concepts as a Tier 3 intervention. It was recommended by Jenna Richard and Nicole Bucca, and it's been awesome. We often say that Connecting Math Concepts isn't necessarily fun for kids because it's very black and white, but they love it because they're very, very successful. And we've seen a lot of good transfer and gap closure because of it, where it's really becoming a really good 6 to 8 week intervention, and kids are moving out of it pretty quickly. So we started that at the 1st grade level this year. Not my school, because my school isn't 1st grade, but we started that off at the younger grades now. So hopefully we have less and less kids that need it. So, and it's cheap. I just want to put a plug in for that. Tier 1 programs are really expensive. I think that's what's intimidating for some people to get started, because everybody knows what the budget looks like across the whole state right now. But Tier 3, Tier 2 interventions in the grand scheme of budgets are really cheap.
Thanks, Courtney.
Sure. Are you ready for the next question? I would love to start a pilot in one of my schools. I'm a math coach, and I'm sure my pilot and I'm sure my principal would be on board. What is the first step?
That's a good question. So, in the materials, the calendar event for this event, those leadership takeaways, that video, and those, there's like a handout. It would be really good if you could take a look at those things, share this webinar, first of all, to give your principal a sense of what the work is, and then share those leadership takeaways, because, I think some of the barriers that we hit would not have happened if those resources had been made and shared in advance, but we didn't know that yet, right?
Can I jump in on that one too, Nicole?
Please.
So, having lived this in a few places now, I think the first step is to make sure that your district leadership is on board as well, because it does require, a total effort across the entire board. And like Nicole said, if it just lives in isolation in one school, it's a big equity issue. So for me as a principal, it was really crucial that I had my district administrators on board. Obviously, Julie Mayhew is with us today, is my curriculum director. So that's been essential. Julie attends all of our meetings that she can possibly attend. She does the learning right alongside us. So she's a really good advocate for this at the central office level. I will say that this would be overwhelming to do with an entire school. So my advice is to find your people. Start with the core team. Find your people that are going to be champions for the work, that are invested in this learning, and start small with them. Where you do the heavy lifting, we're still doing that with a small core team. Of representatives that kind of cover the building with special ed, reading specialists, grade level, a lead, someone of the sort, so that you can really dig into this work using a lot of the free resources that exist out there on Bridge RI. And then you just scale up through there. You share what the entire faculty needs to know, and you don't share what the entire faculty needs to know, to keep it manageable and not overwhelm people. So that's my big piece of advice is the district needs to also be on board, and you need a core team, boots on the ground people that are going to learn right alongside you.
Great points. Thank you.
So there are two more questions that are in now. So one of them is, what are the challenges you have seen with effective implementation of Tier 1, which I would assume frees up staff resources to provide Tier 2 and 3 interventions?
Because, Julie, I don't know if you want to say anything about that, being the curriculum director. Don't feel like obligated. I just feel like you're here, and I know you probably have answers to lots of these questions.
Sure, no, I can jump in on that one. I would say that probably one of the biggest supports to our moving forward with this work has been the implementation of high quality instructional materials across all our grade levels, especially ELA and math, which are two big areas of focus. Prior to this time, when we tried to take steps to get our MTSS program aligned and coherent in the district, where we almost always fell apart was the fact that we didn't really have a coherent core curriculum. And as you know, I'm sure, if we don't have a core curriculum that is meeting the needs of the majority of our students, it gets very, very difficult to try to provide intervention because you feel like you're trying to provide intervention for everyone. So that high quality curriculum implementation has been really critical. And I would add to that too, and I say this with a lot of sincerity and humility, having that district piece is so critical to the process, because you need the school level to really dig in, that boots on the ground stuff that Courtney was referring to. But at the district level, you need somebody who can look at the big picture and say, this is a priority, not just for that school and not just for that principal or these teachers. It is a priority for all of us, because it informs decision-making going out for many, many years, right? And so sometimes principals don't always have that perspective. You need somebody at the district level who has that perspective and can say, no, MTSS is the highest priority. That is what we're going to keep in mind when we're making budgetary decisions, curriculum decisions, intervention decisions, whatever decisions. So getting that piece aligned is really critical. And getting back to the core instructional piece, you also need somebody who's going to say, look, this is what we have as an expectation for our district, for all teachers who are implementing this curriculum. It's not just about the materials. It's also about what's our vision for instructional practice? What's our vision for supporting all students in the classroom? How do we want this to work for every single child that comes into our buildings?
Thank you, Julie. We only have 1 minute left. I wonder if Courtney or Jill had anything they wanted to say about the Tier 1 question. I can recap it really quick. It was, what are the challenges you have seen with effective implementation of Tier 1, which I would assume frees up staff resources to provide Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions? It's okay if you don't have comments, but if you do, I wanted to give you the last minute.
Yeah, I mean, just to reiterate what Julie said, you can't intervene your way out of a Tier 1 issue, right? So when we look at, just like, Jill had mentioned as well, our district uses data days. And when we sit and look at the grade level data, we also drill down to, the homeroom teacher as well. And one of the things we look at is if 80% of students are reaching proficiency on the screening data. And if not, we make adjustments or we add what we need to into the Tier 1 to best meet the needs, of the students that are in that classroom. So with the effective, you're right. Like when the Tier 1 is effective, it does free up staff resources, right? So it does allow, when 80% of those kids are meeting grade level proficiency, you then have more time and more flexibility to intervene at the Tier 2 level. I mean, without getting too in the weeds of it, that, we share a lot of students as well. So, and what I mean by that is they're all of our students. So that was a big mindset shift for us. So if a special ed teacher is taking a group of students that require some level of intervention, and another student who does not have an IEP, but is demonstrating the same level of need, they join the special educators group, and vice versa. Just because a child has an IEP does not mean they don't have an intervention with a regular ed teacher. So I hope that answers your question, in the sense of, who does what, because that's always the big question of time and resources. How do we get this all done? And I think that question kind of speaks to it too, of when you're talking about freeing up staff resources, yes, tier 1 has to be in place, but there also has to be a mindset shift that these are all of our students, IEP or not, special educator, general educator, reading specialist, whoever it might be. It's an all hands on deck approach.
And wrapping up here, I would also say, Courtney, we've had this conversation many times, that one of the big lessons learned early on was do not do this work when you have not yet adopted your high quality core curriculum. Like, we cannot be doing all 3 tiers at the same time. You have to have your core already where it needs to be. It is 4:02, so out of respect for time, I just want to really thank these panelists. I'm sorry it took a little bit too long and we didn't give you, I wanted 15 minutes. Thank you so much for being willing to share your story and being here today.